Thank you. I just wanted to take a few moments before passing over to our Burkina Faso partner, who will give much more rich much more rich detail about the history of what's occurred there and how it's come about. But just to kind of frame why we're looking at Burkina Faso and to situate it in the Nexus approach and perhaps differentiate it a little bit from the other case that we're looking at because it is quite different. So in the case of Burkina Faso, we are looking more at the food and water nexus, although as Peter pointed out, in Brazil there's also a very strong element of land, I think, which you can't take out of both of those. And certainly that is a fundamental aspect of the nexus in Burkina Faso. And so the reason why we're looking at Burkina Faso in this context, in the environment dimension of development progress, is the initial situation in Burkina Faso around agriculture and water was actually quite difficult. And up until the 1980s, Burkina Faso was a prime example of unsustainable agriculture. After decades of overfarming and overgrazing, much of the land, and particularly northern Burkina Faso, which had once been productive land, had become desert, and the Sahel Desert was gradually moving downward. And this fragile situation was exacerbated particularly by a changing climate. So over the last few decades, rain volumes have been decreasing gradually, and perhaps more importantly is that rain patterns have become more unpredictable in the area. And so for an area that is also struck by some of the highest rates of poverty in the world, these factors have combined to make a very difficult situation for smallholder farmers in Burkina Faso, who are the majority in the country. But the reason why we're looking at this case is that in recent decades, this situation has in some ways been reversed. And we wanted to understand how this quite precarious situation has managed to start shifting towards a more sustainable outcome. So in recent decades, some simple but very effective sustainable farming techniques have been introduced in the area to help smallholder farmers adapt to changing climate and desertification encroaching on their area. And we've seen, although perhaps in relative terms quite small but quite significant regreening of areas of parts of Burkina Faso, upwards of around 200,000 to 300,000 hectares of land have been recuperated from deserted lands to productive lands, and farmers are now able to produce on this land, whereas previously they weren't. And the way that these techniques really fit into the nexus, I think, is that they're actually designed to conserve water and also to regenerate land through some quite simple innovations on existing practices that farmers were previously using, so they're quite relevant to the local setting. And they've improved agricultural yields on any particular land area between 35% to 350%. So they actually have quite a significant impact on agricultural outputs. And in Burkina Faso as a whole, agricultural outputs have increased by 82% since 1990. And at the same time, agricultural withdrawals as a percentage of total water withdrawals has decreased, while agricultural output has been increasing. So it's decreased from 81% of total withdrawals in 1995 to 51% in 2005. And at the same time, we've seen an incredible increase in access to drinking water in rural areas in Burkina Faso. And in an area with extreme water shortages, Burkina Faso now surpasses the sub-Saharan African rate for access to clean drinking water in the region. But what I'd like to point out, and what I think the speaker will detail a little bit more, is that the nexus between food and water and land in Burkina Faso is actually quite fragile and quite complex. And so the progress that we've seen in improved farming techniques and the environmental impacts of those, and its translation into improved food security outcomes and nutrition in Burkina Faso has been quite limited. And there are a number of elements that are related to this nexus which need to also occur for these improvements to really bear fruit for more significant human development outcomes in the country, which are still quite meager. So with this, I'll turn over to our Burkina Faso partner. He's Joel Ouedraogo. He's the executive director of the Fédération de Groupement NAM in Burkina Faso, which is essentially a farmers union situated in the north of the country, which has been operating for about 40 years. And they are one of the most important actors in helping producers gain access to these improved techniques. And they support farmers very much on the ground through volunteer extension workers to ensure that these practices are adapted appropriately. And so he's going to talk us through what's been achieved over the last 20 years and what are the remaining challenges.